Hi all, our notable game today is another game from the amazing engine competition currently being played, the TCEC, or as I like to call it, TCEC. Season 8, Stage 3 is underway. And we have, in this game, two of my current and major analytical assistants when I video annotate games. So they're fighting it out. Houdini 4, my ex-analytical assistant, is playing white, and black is Stockfish 070915 playing black. From an evolutionary perspective, perhaps it should be noted that Houdini 4 seems to have not currently in development. I think the last updates a couple of years ago, if you look at the official website, and it's a commercial chess engine, Houdini. Stockfish, on the other hand, is at GitHub. It's a free open source, and as such, anyone can contribute to it. So, from an evolutionary perspective, unless like the lead developer of Houdini carries on, it's not going to evolve. That's one thing to bear in mind, as well as the commercial versus the free aspects. So, Stockfish playing black. The opening given to them is very interesting. It's actually the King's Engine defense. And I believe the sides reversed later in the competition to reduce the bias of the opening. Now, if we go back to like the 70s, you'd think computers like 70s, 80s were mainly just for checking tactics, if serious players looked at them as for checking tactics. And the King's Engine, the flavour of the King's Engine defence, is a very closed position, and you really wouldn't look at engine games usually, 70s, 80s, 90s, for how engines played closed manoeuvring type positions, because brute force, one of the strengths of brute force is in tactical positions where there's like clear forcing sequences. So what can we learn from an engine game in the King's Engine defense? Really, from that point of view, it's kind of outrageous to think if we can learn anything. But let's have a look. So bishop e2, it's as though we're going into the mainline classical King's Engine, and we see e5 here, and yeah, thankfully white avoids the exchange variation, majorly white castles, and in fact that gives black the opportunity to avoid the possibility of the exchange of queens with the older move, knight bd7 instead of knight c6. So knight bd7, more usual is actually knight c6 nowadays. This has a clear idea usually. If white's going to play d5, then the c5 square for the knight is a very nice outpost square and logical. We see rook e1, rook e8, and white is tempted to just close the centre and gain a bit more space, and play for c5 later is an idea, storm the queen side. So d5 is played, we have knight c5 hitting the pawn now, that's protected, and because white's positionally threatening b4, a5 is played to keep the knight there. For those interested, if you want to try and kick the knight with a3, as black usually you'd play a4, you take that risk to try and lock down the queen side. That might be vulnerable in the future, but often it's not, and it just helps secure the knight. So white actually played bishop e3 here, and sometimes it is interesting to consider taking at the right point. We see the knight reinforced again with b6, as though black's got the option now to capture towards the centre. And now knight d2, not fearing this next move, which does actually try and snatch the bishop pair from white. Knight g4. There's no option for bishop g5, thus protecting the bishop on g5, so the bishop's got nowhere to run. Is this an advantage in this position to get the bishop pair though? Isn't white's queenside attack going to be accelerated in some way? Black's taking some time to do this. We see bishop takes g4, bishop takes g4, so okay, black's got the bishop pair. How useful is this bishop in this pawn chain? In fact, how useful? Well, we see a3, white's getting on with things on the queen side. So it looks a very human game at the moment, with logical plans based on what seems to be abstract elements of the position, where you wouldn't think, brute force, the power of computers, electricity running through their veins, calculating millions of positions. Would they really be good in closed manoeuvring type positions where the more abstract features of the position are taken into consideration? But it's a very logical move, a3. We see bishop d7, and now b4, and it looks as though This fianchetto now of the knight is actually quite cute, as well as discouraging c5. Knight b5, and again, c5 might be on the cards now. It seems that's a logical thing to try and hit black's pawn chain hard. Black counterattacks on the king side, threatening tactically f4 to trap the bishop. Some space is made way for the bishop's retreat. We see f4, bishop f2, g5, typical King's Indian defense style position. And now we see queen d3. Okay, and it very much looks as though the queen's making way perhaps for a rook coming to c1 later, as well as reinforcing over here for that c5. That c5 break seems the most logical. Bishop f8, reinforcing against c5, it seems. Rook ab1 now. And then we see black playing against white's pawn chain, where the bonus target is the king. Black plays h5, the typical idea. g4 at some point. And in fact, after rook ec1, black is well prepared, it seems, for the c5 break and plays g4. We see queen c3. Now the king shuffles away, so the g-file might be made use of later. And a very prophylaxis looking move, king f1. Is the king ready for an escape? Bishop e7 now makes way for a rook to come to either g8 or h8. And here, a move which sort of gives up on c5, in fact. B takes a5. Is that the first major strategic mistake? Well, there's a tactical background to this move. If black plays knight takes a5, can you see what white could do here, which is very destructive? If I give you 5 seconds, what would you play here with white? Okay, knight takes c7. That would destroy black's pawns after takes. There's horrible fork. Ouch. So black actually dynamically just accepts the loss of a pawn with knight c5. Very interesting idea from the engines here in this closed position. One of the key things about the King's engine is you want to sort of get some time for your attack without your queenside being totally obliterated, or allowing sometimes the loss of the light square bishop. That signals sometimes the end of attacking prospects. Here black still got both bishops, has lost a pawn, but how significant is this pawn at the moment after a takes, c takes? How significant is it? Black seems to have a nice lockdown on the a pawn at the moment, a nice blockading knight. If this bishop ever takes, then white will be weaker on the dark squares, of course. So we see the king actually going back curiously to g1 now. And it seems now, after rook g8, black has invested that pawn to get some attacking speed. And now white does actually take on c5, which does spell a very dangerous pawn immediately for white. Fundamentally, if takes, then this pawn's ready to roll, or if takes like this, then this pawn is now technically a passed pawn without any stopper at a5. So black does take actually with the b pawn here, and we see this pawn is ready to roll. So has black been given a deadline for the kingside attack? Rook a1. This pawn is ready to roll. Extra pawn. Black has the bishop pair though against the two knights. g3. So threatening immediately what seems to be quite horrible if black allows it. This g takes looks pretty dangerous actually, with pressure immediately on g2. It's not just about winning the pawn. Black plays knight f, pardon me, black plays knight f1. Then we see g takes h2 check, opening up the g file. Knight takes h2, and h4. So it seems the pressure is being built now on g2. White defends with the second rank, rook c2, and is ready for rook a2 if needed as well. Queen c8 is played here. king h1, rook g3. So h3 might be useful. We see knight f1, and now a very clever looking move is played, queen h8. So not only, of course, welcoming if that rook is taken, the queen is ready to storm down that h file if the king moves. We see now knight c7, infiltration by the knight. The rook goes to g8, and the knight further infiltrates via e6. Is this terminal getting a knight here? Doesn't have to be taken. Black just plays calmly king g6. So it looks as though h3 is on the way. a4. This pawn's got a long way to go, hasn't it? Now h3 isn't played here. In fact, king f7 is played, keeping some options open. And we see a defensive retreat, queen e1. And now, one of the most fascinating moves I consider of this game, which ticks two major boxes in the position. Remember when I said in general, as King's Indian players, I think many of us feel the pattern that when we lose our light square bishop, or it loses its impact on this diagonal, then it makes it more difficult to achieve pawn breaks here, in particular h3, where it loses the impetus of the attack. There's an ingenious use made of this light squared bishop in this position, which ticks two boxes. One, to try and stop the impending progress of the passed a pawn, and two, to put black under pressure on the queen side. Bishop c8, so ready to take up that important blockade square and put pressure on c4. It's a beautiful place for the bishop here, absolutely beautiful place for that bishop. And you see that the rook is kind of overloaded. It's not just trying to defend c4, but also defend against rook takes g2. So it seems here that after a5, bishop a6, of course White might want to chase the bishop away from the blockade, but then there might be bishop takes c4, because crashing through with rook takes g2 looks very, very dangerous. So White, for whatever reason, that might be the key reason, it looks the absolute key reason basically, not to move knight c7, but Black has to put up with this blockade of its a pawn, that extra pawn made to be a token advantage. And in fact, Black's bishop pair is working quite well in this position. We see rook a2, another defensive move across that second rank. But now h3, finally h3 here, the breakthrough, h3. So with some pressure on the queen side, and with this pawn under lock and key, as Nimzovich might say, the passed pawn is a criminal and needs to be kept under lock and key. But combining that with the kingside attack. So who says nowadays we can't learn anything from engines in closed positions? This seems to be basically, as a King's Indian player and enthusiast myself, seems to be a fairly instructive King's Indian game so far. That temporary pawn sack and then making White's extra pawn a little bit tokenized just to be blockaded. We see now White losing patience with Black's attacking pieces. Knight takes g3, but this installs a very dangerous looking very dangerous looking pawn on g3, more a goal hanging pawn around the goal, which is the king. The king tries to make an escape, it seems. King g1, h takes g2, threatening queen h2, queen h1 immediately. Rook takes g2, and the pawn is actually attacked. It's actually defended with the option now to try and play rook h8 and then queen h1. Rather crude, but look, White is under pressure on this side of the board as well as this side of the board. So queen e2 here is played, and White has some shuffling resources, so this isn't a total disaster it seems, because there might be king f1, and if check, rook g1. Okay, so for the moment Black plays queen h6, which immediately threatens queen c1, which looks really dangerous. If the queen f1, then taking, and then bishop takes c4 check, looks juicy, etc. So that's actually parried, but the queen now has been lured subtly onto that dark square, and after queen h4, maybe it's not as comfortable as it was on e2, so that was a subtle improvement to black's position. The queen now stays on the dark squares with the move queen c3, preparing an evacuation of the king. Now after rook h8, the king goes to f1. The queen is of course protecting f3, so any check, rook g1, the queen is protecting that f3, but black now plays rook b1, so probing on this side of the board now, as well as this diagonal, as well as this file. King e2, trying to step out of the danger zones. But now coordination on c4, rook b4, again further justifying the blockading bishop. Who says the blockading bishop is happy enough just blockading? It's also attacking. It's also helping the attack against white's king. We see now black seems to be crashing through after this, because white plays queen e1. Isn't it too dangerous to give up c4 just to chase g3? Bishop takes c4 check. Isn't this also potentially winning back an exchange? Or winning the exchange rather? Well, winning back the exchange, because remember, black lost the exchange on that exchange sack there. In fact, black does now have the option of just taking an entire rook as well. It's not just the case of winning the exchange, it's winning an entire rook. Because white played king d2 here. White didn't even bother with king d1, and the reason, it looks as though rook b1 is a nasty skewer if king d1. that doesn't seem palatable to lose the queen. So yeah, white's just lost a rook, so is losing material. Queen takes g3. Surely white now is just a piece down. But for a passed pawn here, well, black plays rook b2 check. King d3, we see c4 check. It looks pretty hopeless. Rook b3 check, very accurate. If it takes, rook takes f3 check, winning the queen. Now here, bishop b1 check. And after king d1, I think the operator might have resigned on the engine's behalf. Unless they've changed things this year and the engine's just resigned on their own behalf. But white resigns here. White is a piece down after the smoke is cleared here. White is a piece down, but also let's see what happens in this final position. And we'll use Stockfish as our analytical assistant. So a smaller home edition of Stockfish can tell us. Black in this position after king d1. This might be one of the better moves, queen h1. And then just taking on f3. And yeah, white's pawn is not going anywhere, surely. In fact, black can just try and mop it up with rook a3. So piece up, and not only that, black's gonna have this nice c pawn soon as well to play with. So things are not going to last too long. A piece down. You might wonder. Let's go back to king d1. If king d2, c3 check, check. Here, this is good. Rook takes g2. Remember, the queen's also protected here. This check is actually not so harmful. It doesn't do anything. In fact, rook takes g7. So yeah, this is hopeless. Yeah, check. It's a hopeless position again for white. So I thought that was a good attacking game from a King's Indian defense player perspective to have a look at. I hope you did too. It seems the real ingenuity of it in this game was a temporary pawn sacrifice. It bypassed not only a tactical disaster, obviously the engine's not going to fail too much tactically, but by temporarily sacrificing the pawn, giving white, okay, technically an extra pawn, but the light square bishop blockade was putting pressure on the queen side. The exchange sack worked well with this pressure along that diagonal. Remember that white had given up that light square bishop early on in the opening, and usually you'd think the light square bishop's not that significant in that structure, but a6 was an excellent square blockading white's extra pawn, putting pressure along that diagonal and adding a bit of fuel to black's attack. It wasn't just a one-dimensional attack on the king side, it was also via the queen side, that b file, and across the diagonal. So a multi-lane attack against the white king, making use of an amazingly deep pawn sacrifice. Fantastic King's Engine game, I believe. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.